Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, maybe I'll have earned your subscription. What I'm going to be talking about in today's episode is I'm going to be covering part 10 of my neck through guitar build. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sand the body halves and the neck in preparation for gluing the halves to the neck. Now, before I do this, I want to bring you a little closer and show you a couple of issues that came up while making both the neck and the body halves. Things I'm going to have to address as I prepare to glue all this together. All right, so when I was cutting all these parts out on my CNC machine, I noticed when I was cutting the neck, the bit kind of cut out an area in here that it really wasn't supposed to cut. And that happened here, 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 and here. So it's like a little notch that was cut out. And I'm not sure why that happened. I looked at the files and I can't see anything, but I think because there are a number of different cutting operations and different G-code files that I use to create the pockets as well as this perimeter shape, I think that one might be off just slightly. Maybe a 32nd of an inch, and that would cause that. So I'm gonna have to go back in and take a look at that and see if I did accidentally shift. I believe it would be the pockets back a little bit, and then I can fix that. But once I glue the sides to the body, there's a little bit of a gap here. However, I'm pretty confident that when I clamp this together, the squeeze out of glue in here, I'm gonna be able to pack that with wood dust to fill that area in. Also, I'm going to have pickup rings, and those pickup rings are going to not completely cover, but cover enough of that I don't think it's going to even be noticeable. So we'll see how that goes as I work on this. But I also noticed that it's a little bit off on the leading edge here. But again, you're not going to be able to see that once it's covered up with the pickup rings. And it may not even be noticeable at all. I don't know. We'll just have to see. But then another problem I had was there's some chip out or tear out that was caused by the router bit as it was cutting the pickup pockets. And I think what caused that was the fact that I was using an upcut bit, and I should have probably used a downcut bit to cut these. And that would have hopefully produce less of chip out there. And there was also a little bit more around in this area here, but all of that can be fixed pretty easily as I start to glue up and bring these pieces together. But then there was another strange occurrence that happened here. It was like my CNC machine lost its place, but only momentarily, because then it finished off. Everything was fine, but as the router bit was cutting down, it created this little divot here, and that's not present in the file itself, so I'm not sure what happened here. That can be sanded away, however, fortunately. This isn't a critical area, so I can sand that away and it should be just fine. And then one last area is along the back here. Okay, if you look closely here, you can see that the body halves don't line up nicely with the neck through portion of the tenon. There's a gap here, and I think that was just simply caused by that part of the wood getting really thin as I was machining it, and it all kind of chipped away. So I'm going to have to sand this whole area in order for everything to line up, to match, and to appear as though it was intended to be that way. So I'm going to actually have to remove quite a bit of material here. But again, this isn't something that you would even notice unless I mentioned it to you. So let's head out into the workshop and we'll get started sanding everything. All right guys, we're out here in my shop and I'm getting ready to start sanding the body and the neck. But first I wanted to show you some of the tools that I like to use when it comes to sanding. Sanding can be really tedious, and it can also be physically demanding, especially when you're doing a lot of guitars. If you're just making one guitar as a hobby project, it's not that big a deal just to do all the sanding by hand. You really don't need to invest in a lot of power tools to do the work. However, if you're going to be making a lot of guitars or batches of guitars, you're going to probably want to invest in some power sanding equipment to help make that process a little less strenuous. And when I say strenuous, it can really take its toll on your elbows, your wrists, your hands, your knuckles, and over time it can just really do a lot of wear and tear. So the power tools can save the day. Now, the power tools that I like to use the most are my oscillating spindle sander, my small bench top, this is a 4x24, I think, belt sander. And then I have an assortment of handheld random orbital sanders. I've got the disc type, I've got a sheet fed type, and just a variety of different tools that I use. But these two machines, the oscillating spindle sander and the belt sander, are the ones that I really use the most. And I'll use them typically with like an 80 grit sandpaper in order to remove the most wood as quickly as possible to bring the shape of the guitar and the neck right where I want it as quickly as possible. From there, I will typically move over and start doing hand sanding. When it comes to sanding by hand, I use a lot of different sanding blocks, all of which I made myself or I repurposed from other items. I typically will use a lot of different size wooden blocks, and I also like to use, and I've mentioned this before in other videos, rubber erasers. Different sized rubber erasers, like this little pink one here, or this little blue one that I got at the dollar store. I also like to look for these large oversized erasers as well. And these are great because they'll conform to the shape of whatever it is you're sanding, but you can also cut them up into different sizes so that you can tailor make your sanding blocks for whatever application you need it for. I also like to use aluminum tubing. And in many other cases, I'll use like scrap PVC that I'll cut to length. And sometimes I'll even use these rubber sleeves from my oscillating spindle sander. They work great because they can also conform to the shape of whatever I'm sanding. Now, as far as the abrasives are concerned, what I've been using a lot lately is the 3M Pro Grade sheets, and you can pick these up at most of the big box hardware stores. And this is a really good quality sandpaper. It works very well. I also like to use Mirka Base Cut, and you can purchase those in bulk online or just buy the number of sheets that you need at your local big box store. But I always try to have an assortment ranging in grits from 80 all the way to 220 or to 400, and every grit in between. So I'll do 80, 100, 120, 150, 180, 220, 320, and 400. And typically when I'm sanding wood, I'll go from the coarsest, like say an 80 or a 100. I always try to start out with the finest gray that I can get away with, and then if necessary, I'll back down to a coarser grit. But when you start with the finest grit possible, you don't have as many grits to work through, but you don't want to skip different grits as you move up through the range in sanding abrasive grades, because you will end up with scratches in the surface of the wood that will telegraph up through your finish and you won't be able to get rid of them. But if you work your way up through those grits, using every single one of them, you will have a much better quality finish. Now, as far as the power handheld random orbital type sanders, these will work really great as long as you buy a high quality sander. Don't skimp here and buy something cheap. Because what happens is with a cheap quality sander and like a budget quality abrasive, you'll notice as you're sanding these tiny little curly-Q scratches that will appear on the surface, and they can be an absolute nightmare to try to remove. But when you buy a really high quality sander, they typically aren't going to leave those kind of scratches. And you also want to make sure you've dialed in your technique and understand how to use these. I see guys just, doing this back and forth and just going like crazy with the sander. And that's a guarantee of a flawed surface full of those curly-Q scratches. You want to use the weight of the sander itself, and you just want to move it at a very, very slow rate. And that will give you a much better quality finish. And To use them, of course, you're going to need sanding discs. And over the years, I've used a lot of different kinds of sanders with different kinds of discs. And most of my sanders are the 8-hole variety for dust extraction. So I either buy these generic patterns or I'll buy an actual 8-hole disc. And that helps to remove the dust as you're sanding. And then, of course, to get rid of the dust, you can't just have holes in there. And yeah, you can have the type of sander that has a little bag attached to the back, but those never really work all that well to extract the dust. What does work well, however, is to connect a dust extraction system. And I have a hose that I can attach to all my different tools to suck away that dust as I'm sanding, and that improves the quality of the finish greatly. Now, another type of disc that I'm really I've taken a liking to are these. These are they're kind of a net type sanding disc, and this is a Diablo sand net. I think I picked this up at Home Depot. There are a variety of these kind of products that are available. I know that I believe it's Mirka has their AbraNet product, and I've used all these different products and they work really well. You do, however, have to have a interface pad that goes between the net and the sander itself, but they do a great job of sanding away material, not leaving those curly Q scratches, and producing a really great quality finish. So I definitely recommend that you check out the net type abrasives. And also, as another bonus, they last a long time. So you're not going through as many discs as you probably did with the paper or the film discs that we typically use with this type of sander. All right, so I'm ready to start sanding the body halves. And all I'm going to do is sand the perimeter with the exception of where the body half is going to join with the neck. I don't want to mess with this. I don't want to touch it at all, because any sanding that I do in here would affect the fit with the neck. So I'm just going to leave that alone, and I'm going to focus on sanding to remove where I cut the tabs, some of the tool marks, and I'm using the largest drum on my oscillating spindle sander with an 80 grit sandpaper to quickly remove that wood and to get the surface as smooth as possible. So first I'm going to fire up the dust collector. And now we're ready to sand. Oh, one other thing I should mention. This is a rubber sanding cleaner, and these come in large blocks. Mine's gotten kind of worn down, but they're used for cleaning the surface of the sandpaper once it starts to clog up. And that's something I definitely highly recommend you consider. Now, when using this type of a sander, you want to be careful about lingering for too long in any one spot, or it will form a groove in the wood. So you just want to constantly be moving the wood against the surface and pulling away so that it doesn't stay in one spot for too long. Now what I have to do to get into this lower portion of this cutaway is I'm going to have to switch to a different size sanding drum. This is the one I'm going to use. Now I've got to switch back to the larger drum and repeat the process on the upper portion of the body. Now this is that spot along the edge where the router, or the spindle on my CNC took out a divot here. So I've got to work this area, and as you can see, I lingered too long here and it burned the wood. So fortunately all that's going to get sanded away. All right, I've removed that little divot there, and it doesn't look that much different than it did before, so the shape is still pretty close to the same. Now I'll just finish sanding this back part here, this little cutaway contour, and then I can start to hand sand it. For this back part of the body where the body halves meet the neck, where I have this gap on both sides, I think what I'm going to do, the strategy that I'm going to follow is, instead of sanding it now, I'm going to wait until after I've glued the body halves to the neck. Then I can sand this area all at once and get it perfectly smooth so that there's no gaps here and that there's just a nice fine line of delineation between the different species of wood. After evaluating the surface, I decided that instead of sanding, starting out with 80 grit and then working my way up, I would jump a few grits and start with 120 because the surface is smooth enough that I can sand with 120 and then move on to the 150, 180, 223, 2400. That's just going to save me a lot of time. So I've got my piece of sandpaper. This is the Mirka base cut, and I've just folded it around one of these goofy rubber oversized erasers. And that's what I'm going to use to sand. And I basically follow the same process that furniture makers and cabinet makers use when sanding by hand. I follow the direction of the grain wherever possible. That's not always possible in some of these contoured cutaway areas. But since I'm going to be sanding all the way to 400 grit eventually, that's not going to matter because you're not going to see the sanding scratches. One of the reasons we sand with the grain is to hide sanding scratches so that they appear to look like the grain. But since I'm going to be sanding to a much finer grit, that's not going to be as big of an issue. Now, a question that comes up a lot, and I think it's one of the most difficult questions to answer when it comes to woodworking, and that is, how do you know when it's time to go from, let's say, 80 grit to 100 grit, or 100 grit to 120, or in this case, like what I'm doing, from 120 to 150? How do you know when you're done with one grit and it's time to move on to the next grit? Well, before you start to sand, you want to check the surface and gauge it very carefully to check its condition. That's one of the ways that I determine what sanding grit to start out with. But what I like to do is hold it up to a bright light so that my eyes are at a low angle to the surface and I can really see the condition of that surface. When you start to sand, you will notice as you continue to check it, that surface gradually begins to change, and a scratch pattern is formed by the sandpaper you're using. And what you'll end up with is, let's say you start with a 120 grit, the entire surface will be covered uniformly with 120 grit sanding scratches. And wherever you see areas where it doesn't appear that there are any of those scratches, you know to work those areas more. But once the entire surface is covered in a consistent scratch pattern, you'll know you're done with the grit that you're currently using and can step up to the next grit. That's how you tell when you're ready to go. All you need is a pair of good eyes and a bright light to check your work with. Now I have to be really careful when sanding in this area here, because this is the part that will join to the neck, and I don't want to change the shape too much, otherwise it's not going to match up with the neck. Now in truth that's not a big deal, because once they're all glued together I could then sand them to get them to blend. But I'm a big believer in less work is better. Still too many tool marks. Now some of you might remember I made a downdraft table, which I can connect to my dust collector to suck away the dust as I'm sanding. However, I found that it's just not as effective as I had hoped it would be. And I've found a much better way to extract dust when I'm hand sanding. My ceiling mounted dust extraction system. So I'm not as concerned about dust in the air as long as I have that ceiling dust collection system switched on. Years ago, when I was just a little kid, I was in Cub Scouts and I had to make what they call a pine wood derby car. And that's where you take a block of pine wood and you carve it into the shape of a car, which you then enter into a race. And when I made the car, I carved away the wood to create the shape of the car that I wanted. And once that was done, before we could paint it, my dad said, you need to sand it and make it really smooth before we can paint it. So I started sanding. And I'd sand for, 10, 15 minutes. And then I'd say, okay, is it ready? And my dad would look at it and say, nope, needs more sanding. So I keep sanding. This went on, I think, for like 2 days of me sanding and sanding and sanding and sanding until my dad finally said, okay, it's ready for paint. But that's how sanding is. I get questions all the time from viewers who will say, how do I get rid of these tool marks? What's the trick? The trick is to keep sanding and sanding and sanding and sanding. Yeah, that can sound like it's going to drive you crazy, but that's the difference between a guitar that looks professional, that looks really good with very, high level of craftsmanship, and a guitar that you can see tool marks in that, well, looks like a piece of crap. So you just got to keep sanding and use your light overhead to gauge your progress and to see when those tool marks have disappeared. And then you can move up through the grits, and the next thing you know, you're ready to start applying your finish or your paint or whatever. And it's going to look so much better. Now here's another tip for you. All that sanding dust that you're generating, don't dump it out. Try to save as much as you can, because you may end up using it later on to fill defects in the wood. The neck is going to be sanded in exactly the same fashion. I'll start with 120 grit sandpaper, then I'll move on to 150, 180, 220, 320, 400. And I'm going to sand it in pretty much the same way as I did the halves of the body, with one exception. I'm not going to touch the fretboard. The fretboard has already been sanded to, I think it was 1200 grit. So I don't need to do anything to the fretboard, but I do need to sand the back contour of the neck. And again, where the body will meet the neck, I'm not going to touch that. I'm just going to leave it alone. It's fine the way it is. So I'm just going to focus my efforts on the back contour, the headstock, front and back and sides. So I'm going to get a fresh piece of sandpaper here And again, this is 120 grit. And then I will just begin sanding. Okay, I have finished sanding the body and the neck to 150 grit, and I've decided that's where I'm going to stop. And the reason for that is because at 150 grit, I can still change the surface shape as I'm sanding. When you move on to like 180, 220 and beyond, it becomes more difficult to change the shape of the wood that you're sanding, but I can still do that with 150. So I want to glue these halves to the body or to the neck, and then I want to be able to sand the surfaces to get them to all blend and to match up and to be consistent. And I can do that with 150. It becomes much more difficult if I sand it beyond that. So I'll take it to a higher grit later on after I've glued the halves to the body and I've done the final 150 grit sanding. At that point, I'll go on to 180, 220, 320, 400, and probably that's as far as I'll go. All right, guys, well, that's all the time I've got for this episode. This one's getting kind of long, but I'm hoping it has some useful information that you can put to work on one of your guitar projects. At any rate, what I plan to do in the next episode, which will be part 11, is I'm going to glue the body wings to the neck. And then once that's done, I can finish the sanding, taking it from 150, which is where it's at right now, all the way up to 400. From that point, I can then start to look at completing the assembly of the guitar by installing tuners and pickups and bridge, electronics, all that good stuff. And then I can start to apply the finish. So I don't think I'll get all that done in the next episode, but in the next few episodes, I should be able to complete the guitar. So until the next episode, as always, I hope you got something out of this video. If so, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're new to the channel, again, welcome. I hope that you've enjoyed this video and will consider subscribing to my channel so that you can see all of the guitar building videos that I produce. And until the next episode, as always, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for the next episode.